Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I got Terry Foy, CEO of Inside Lacrosse, here to do a little Q&A about recruiting. Terry and I have known each other for a long time. We were just kind of catching up about how long it's actually been. Terry, I think in his early days of working at Inside Lacrosse, covered one of my high school
Crowning achievements?
Yeah, my senior year, when we beat Boys Latin a couple times. Terry covered some of our games. We're going to plug these later on, but Terry's done some great podcasts with current college coaches about recruiting, and we're going to resource you guys with those later on. But honored to have Terry on here. He knows as much as anyone, other than the coaches and things like that, about recruiting. And just kind of wanted to hand it off to him to start. Just kind of, there's a lot going on, Terry, with NIL. Scholarship and roster expansion, which is important, I think, for players and families to have a grasp of. But that aside, like, what's the general state of recruiting, would you say, for college lacrosse?
Yeah, I think that it really depends on the level that we're talking about from the standpoint of the quality of the program. And, I think it might seem crazy that after 7 years, the ecosystem is still adjusting to a rule change that eliminated early recruiting, meaning the ability to get high school freshmen, sophomores, and sometimes eighth graders to commit to your program. But I do think it's true. And I also think that the timing of the COVID pandemic and the way in which an entire class year of players were recruited during a dead period, such that there were no visits and everything that went along with that. And then now, some of the things that have changed in terms of the timing and the way in which we've seen the class of 2026 commit to the top 20 programs of Division I much more quickly than the 25s did, who committed much more quickly than the 24s did. It's created a circumstance where there is definitely an accelerating pace of considerations for that high end of Division I, and then for the remainder of Division I and all of Division II and III, the kind of protracted opportunity to evaluate players multiple times and everything that goes along with that has actually, I think, had the reverse effect where, getting opportunity to see juniors and seniors in the fall and certainly rising seniors in the summer after their junior year has become even more important. And so, we've seen a tremendous percentage of Division II and Division III athletes committing in July and August heading into their senior year. And then, probably about, let's say, in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% of Division I committing after their senior year starts, and then probably about 50 to 75% of Division II and Division III lacrosse players committing during their senior year as well.
It's interesting. I think back to my experience. I think I committed in like October of my senior year, and I'd taken a couple official visits where, these were overnight stays at Loyola and Butler, where I ended up going. But, it sort of like went from later to much earlier, and now it's back to a little bit later, obviously with some changes in the rules and things like that. So we have guys on the call that will, be playing in some recruiting tournaments the next, few weekends in upcoming months. What would you encourage players to do, don't do? How do you stand out when you're in like a recruiting, whether it's a showcase or tournament setting?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing is be a great teammate. And the second thing is do your best not to think about it. Because ultimately, a coach doesn't want to recruit you to be a part of his team because you're doing something extra special by virtue of being in a showcase or a recruiting tournament environment. They want to recruit. Ultimately, when it comes to sports, the most valuable skill and the most valuable thing is consistency. And so they want to recruit you for who you are, not for who you can be in an outlier situation. And so I think the biggest concern that a coach has when they build their roster is, am I bringing in players who are going to disrupt the culture of what I have built here? And so I have never spoken to a coach who hasn't emphasized and heavily valued the demonstration of being a good teammate. Now, how that manifests is a lot different. Some guys put a lot of weight on how you celebrate. Other guys put a lot of weight on how you hold your teammates accountable if they make a mistake, or how you try to reorganize the group when you're facing adversity. It manifests in a bunch of different ways. And I think ultimately the second point that I made kind of informs the first point, which is whatever it is that you do, whatever your role is on your team, just do that. And if you feel like maybe you don't have as significant or high profile of a role when it comes to, being who you are as a teammate, then that would be my piece of advice. Take advantage of this next opportunity to compete to say, all right, I'm going to be the cheerleader, or, I'm going to be the communicator, or I'm going to be the accountability guy, whatever it is. Like there are enough roles for as many guys as there are on a team to fill that all have value at the next level. And coaches do pay attention to that. It is very easy to identify talent and athleticism. They spend a lot more of their time trying to figure out who is going to make my program better.
That's a great point. I mean, I think a lot about, like, in our day and age of social media and highlights and things like that. Sometimes I think we as coaches, we see something happen and we almost cringe because we're like, although that's great, that doesn't play well with coaches, right? Whatever it may be.
Well, I want to make that point specifically, is that I think a lot of times when folks think about highlight videos, and specifically, the players on this call, this is not said with criticism. I would expect that you guys want to make a highlight video that your friends think is cool. And again, that's great. What your friends think is cool is almost never going to be what a college coach thinks is cool. And so I would almost advise you to just make 2 cuts. Make one that goes on YouTube that gets spread around, and make a unlisted one that you send to college coaches that show not the behind the back that stung the corner that you can only do once out of 100 times, and the college coach does not care about your ability to do it that one time. Like, show how you were able to support in defense and, make a good slide decision and show up on time consistently. The things that they know that you're going to be able to do, again, consistently, sustainably, and fill a role that they have a need for on their program.
Yeah, that's well said. Well said. So what about, players in, Las Vegas, Southwest, the West Coast, that maybe don't feel like they're have the opportunity to get the exposure, just for like full clarity perspective. I mean, I remember growing up in Baltimore, the only times we'd see the college coaches on the sideline was like the playoffs that were happening in May. And that's because it was Hopkins and Towson.
It was convenient.
They could drive 5 minutes to do it. So it's not as if everywhere around the country, like, coaches are and they got their own season. So outside of the spring, what suggestions do you have other than highlight film or whatever for, kids in the Southwest?
Yeah, I struggle with this one because I don't want to make it seem like exposure is not important. I think that there is a certain group of athlete and a certain group of lacrosse player for whom exposure does not matter. You are so good that it takes one opportunity to be evaluated, and there's going to be a coach that wants you to be a part of his program. But I do know that there is a group of players who, for lack of a better way of putting it, are – I don't want to – using the term marginal sounds harsh, and that's not what I mean it to be. What I mean is that – the distinctions in your game relative to another athlete for whom you might be competing with the same, or with whom you might be competing for the same spot, are nuanced enough that it actually does require being watched multiple times in detail in order to decide, this is the individual that I want to be a part of my program. I don't think that folks from any particular region are disadvantaged from the standpoint of exposure inherently, because I do think it's offset by some positive stereotypes that come along with it. So I think a lot of guys that are from the Southeast get positively stereotyped as being more athletic than players from the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. So effectively, you kind of have to balance those things out, right? Like, maybe it's a little, it's considerably less convenient to be seen. So for that, you have my sympathy. But at the same time, I don't think that it's necessarily disqualifying that you're from where you're from, because I also think that there are enough examples of players that have come through programs at every level of college lacrosse who have been successful and helped to form those positive stereotypes. So I think what it really comes down to is recruiting is a process that is inherently outside of your control. And so the piece of advice that I give to everybody as they set out in the process is control what you can control. And for me, that is the discernment process of what type of program you would want to be a part of. Because I think that there's too many folks who their primary judgment is who's going to recruit me. And I think that oftentimes that creates a very pothole-filled situation that starts from nobody, right? Like there's just, you don't get any phone calls or emails or anybody that wants you to be a part of their program, to then into a point where, oh, well, I got this piece of interest, like I have to pursue it. Meanwhile, had you done the discernment process up front and try to decide, do I want to go to a rural school or an urban school, a big school or a small school? Do I have a particular major that I want to pursue? And all of a sudden you get interest from a program or an institution that doesn't have any of the things that you wanted. Well, now you start to sell yourself on the fact that maybe I could want it, right? And I think that's where a lot of mistakes are made. So my first piece of advice when it comes to controlling the recruiting process is, before the moment of contact arrives, just think about what type of environment you probably would want to be a part of, what you think would make you happy, so that when it comes, if they fall outside of that profile, it doesn't mean you can't go there. It doesn't mean it wouldn't be a good fit. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't want to be a part of that program. But at least you know that it wasn't what you initially thought. And so now you can go in a little bit more clear-eyed about, all right, is this a good fit for me? I'm gonna have to overcome the fact that I wanted to go to a school in a big city and this is in the middle of nowhere. But you know what? Some of the other attributes of what this place offers, I can live with being in the middle of nowhere. Or, well, we don't need to get into particular examples, but so that's one element of it. And I would say that controlling what you can control in the process, at the very least, gives you, I think, a lot of consolation, because it is very rarely a smooth process for anybody. And so when you encounter the adversity of not getting the level of interest or not having the type of engagement that you wanted, I think that it provides a lot of consolation to be able to say, like, oh, at least I did all I could.
Yeah, I can remember being encouraged to do sort of just that, like try to kind of figure out what would your ideal fit maybe, and there's a number of different ways you can look at it, from big school, small school, state school, private, near, far, and that's not even getting into the education side of it and the athletic side of it. But, I think that's a wise thing for people to do, is like, where would I think I'd fit based on like where I am currently, whether I go to private school, public school now, and is that going to be a huge adjustment for me? I think, you probably know more than you think you do about, where might be a good fit for you if you just took some time to kind of think it through a little bit.
And the other thing about that exercise is that there's, with some exceptions, programs that fit those profiles at every competitive level. Yeah. And so it allows you to say, like, all right, I want to go to an elite academic institution. There are elite academic institutions that compete for Division I national championships, compete at the lower end of Division I, compete at the high end of Division II, and certainly at the high end of Division III, and then all throughout the spectrum. And so if that is what you want, you can kind of build out your criteria matrix there, and then depending on how that interest flows, you can at least, kind of have a sense for what the opportunities are and make them available to you.
Yeah, for sure. It's we're going to show, and they'll see the different geographic locations and numbers, because I don't think people realize Division III, is wild in terms of number of schools, where they are, and really everything from, a Salisbury to the NESCAC schools are totally different and things like that. But kind of a specific question from one of our players here: minimum GPA that colleges are looking for, and based on maybe your high school and what type of high school you go to, that they're different academically and things like that. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so again, a question that's very dependent. I would say, obviously there's a floor, right, in terms of NCAA qualification, and there are not very many college lacrosse programs that recruit in that neighborhood of the floor. If you're going to struggle to qualify, junior college is probably the best option in terms of creating an opportunity to compete at the next level. From the standpoint of again, like kind of the median range, I would say in that 3.0 level is a safe spot. But certainly, there are aspirational opportunities that if you can't be in the 3.5 to 3.7 range, aren't going to be available to you. And it's not simply the Ivy League programs where you're probably going to have to be in a 4.0 and above range, regardless of where you go, but even places like the service academies and some of the more elite academic institutions that are public schools, like the Michigans and North Carolinas of the world. So I think that the short answer is get your GPA as high as you can. There's nothing that you can do, again, to the point about controlling the controllables. There's nothing you can do that's more in your control than that. From the standpoint of is each transcript look at the same? No. It is a little bit more difficult in a test optional environment relative to prior eras, and it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve as test optionality goes away. And then, separately, some of the internal criteria within some of these departments is changing as well. So it's a difficult question to answer. My recommendation would be, if you're currently getting a 3.3, figure out a way to strive to get a 3.5. If you're getting a 3.5, figure out a way to get a 3.7.
Yeah, I can remember one of my first recruiting calls was Coach Urich at Georgetown, and he asked me what my GPA was on the first phone call. And I told him what it was, and he said, "We wish you luck. We're not going to be able to recruit you with that GPA." And that was okay for me. I wasn't really interested in Georgetown, but it just shows like a lot of these guys, depending on who you are, I was not even a middle of the road recruit, but it was like, unless you're the top couple guys, they're not going to have a huge amount of going outside that range that they're looking for, depending on their standards of that university. Here's a good one, and this is good because people didn't know that I was going to be interviewing you, but how do you get the attention of Inside Lacrosse to be included on lists and rankings?
So the lists and rankings are about 80% informed by college coaches. So the answer to the question is the same as how do you get noticed by college coaches? And it's an art, not a science, both in terms of getting their attention and in terms of how we put together, our rankings lists. So the kind of nuts and bolts of the practice is we start paying attention to a class around this time. We're paying attention to the sophomore class in earnest for the first time. So we have about 125 player evaluations in our database for the class of 2027 right now. And by July 31st of 2025, I estimate that number will be about 650 to 700. And those evaluations will form the basis of what we do in the first 2 weeks of August, which is put together a list of it's probably about 300 players total, or at least it was this year. And that's probably about 125 midfielders, 100 attackmen, and then, I guess it's probably closer to 400 then, because it's probably about 100 defenders, and then probably about 30 to 40 of the specialty position players. And so we put that together again in the first 2 weeks of August, and then for the next 10 days, we talked to the directors of recruiting for as many of the top 30 programs as time allows. And so this year we talked to 24 of them. We met with 2 full staffs in person. We split it up. I handled about 10 of the conversations. Dan Kaplan handled about 10 of the conversations. And we had a spreadsheet. We just went down the list of all the players that we had talked about. And it built as we went along, so that there were guys that we didn't know about because we hadn't seen them over the course of the fall of their sophomore summer through the end of their rising junior summer, or their fall of their sophomore year. And cool. So at the end of that process, we take all of that feedback and all that information and just consolidate it into a list. And then the reason we rank the class twice more, once during their senior year and then once heading into their freshman year in college, is because there were some elements of those conversations that didn't create an accurate picture for how the recruitment was going to go. And then also players' performances change and the prognostication of how good they're going to be at the next level changes. Each of those 3 rankings has a little bit of a different identity in terms of what it's supposed to accomplish. And that first list, the one that comes out in late August before September 1st of your junior year, is really, I like to think of it as a stock market watch. It's a reflection of effectively how in demand each player is relative to the most desirable places that kind of lead the front end of recruiting. And so as a result, it's not to say, it's not even really necessarily meant to be a depiction of who the best players are, although it also kind of corresponds to that. What it really is a reflection of is, who are going to be the most highly sought after players, by college coaches. And then when we re-rank the list after almost all the players have committed the following year, then it starts to take into a forecast of what their role is going to look like once they get on campus in college.
So for these guys, let's say that they have a particular school, university they're really interested in, or maybe they happen to get, reached out to. How would you kind of describe the process and maybe best practices for, what that communication looks like? How much is too much? Is there, a right amount? Are we calling, texting, emailing? Talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, assuming we're after September 1st of your junior year and you're allowed to get phone calls back from coaches who are interested in you, I think that how I would approach it, it's kind of tough. And Jeremy, let me turn it back on you, because I think you can kind of approach it one of two ways. So the first is you've got a product. In this case, it's yourself, and you're trying to sell it, right? And we've all been sold to, right? Whether it's, I don't know, the door-to-door knife or vacuum cleaner salesman, which is something out of the 50s that most of the kids watching this have no idea what we're talking about. Yeah. Or, somebody that's trying to upsell you on whatever, I don't know, electronic package you're buying, whatever the case may be. So that's one approach, right? In which case, there's, no harm in the sense that, what's the worst that happens? They say no. Yeah. Okay. Then in that case, I wouldn't recommend emailing daily, but, if you're emailing once a week, just saying hey, coach, I'm really interested, would love to learn more about your program. Here's my latest highlight video or whatever. I can make an argument that there's nothing wrong with that. But I could also approach it kind of a romantic relationship where you're trying to get somebody to like you. And you understand that coming on too strong is one of the easiest ways to turn them off. So what do you think? What would your recommendation be?
I would say that, that was kind of before you even said the romantic relationship. That's what I thought about is hey, coming on too strong is a lot. But you don't want to seem disinterested. It's important to market yourself. It's important to, show your qualities and show there's something that I think that I learned in my recruiting process was I want to go somewhere that I'm wanted to, so trying to force it, square peg in a round hole is not ideal. And for me, that's my college playing career was a little bit rerouted because of special circumstance. But, that was really, to me, when I got down to it, this school or that school, I think the thing that put me over the edge on electing Butler over Loyola was I really felt wanted there, and that was important. And I was in a situation where I'd gone on visits to both places and got to know the coaches and all of that. So it's probably a little farther down the road than what we're sort of the question was, but I think that you can sense that as a young person, okay, I haven't heard back. Maybe I should wait a little bit longer and maybe hope to, next time I have a reasonable reason or excuse to reach out to them. Hey, I'm going to be at this event. Are you going to be there? If you are, let's say hi in person, something like that versus
totally
just continuing to email the wall or whatever. You can sense that. And that would be my thing is you got to feel your way through it a good bit. And you can sense when it's okay, I've communicated enough. We've gone far enough here where it's I'm just going to let it rest for a little while. And I think coaches can appreciate that, that sensing of where it is.
I also have one specific piece of advice, which is if you have reached out 3 times and not heard back, that's probably a pretty significant telltale, because as somebody who receives a lot of unsolicited inbound emails, phone calls, whatever the case may be, the first one, if I miss it or if I don't respond to it, it's okay, whatever. I was busy. The second time, I'm oh man, yeah, I really meant to respond to that, but I forgot. Once I get the third one, if guilt drives me to respond as soon as possible, immediately, whatever the case may be, or I just don't care. And so if I haven't responded the third time to a cold outreach, or don't get it, don't understand, you know what I mean? Don't care is probably a little too callous, but if 3 inbounds go unresponded to, then I'm not as invested as I am in something else.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. We'll get you out of here on this one. What are your thoughts about it? And this is a good question for our guys who are gonna, maybe in some cases choose some other events outside of what we do. Like, what do you think about attending prospect days or events at universities of interest?
Yeah, so I think that there's a strong split in the market on this, in the sense that, there are some that are viewed as being supplemental income for the coaching staff. And then there are others that are bona fide recruiting opportunities. And I think the identity of the events themselves are pretty well understood in terms of frequency, how strongly they're marketed, and how big they are. And I think that you can kind of take that for what it's worth, meaning that, if you're getting marketed to multiple times publicly, meaning that, like, your entire team, for instance, is receiving an email for an event that is, at a particular institution, and let's say they have like 3 or 4 days, and there's going to be a couple hundred players at each one. That's not necessarily a recruiting opportunity in terms of being evaluated by that staff. It's just so large that it is an opportunity for that staff to generate some income for their coaches, which isn't a bad thing. And especially if you're an 8th grader, freshman, sophomore, and you actually have interest in the program, it's a great way to see, experience, feel the environment, such that you can decide whether or not it is a place that you're going to set as being your dream school, or whatever the case may be. If you're, getting invited to, let's call it like a 1-day, 88-player, end of the summer of your rising junior year event, then you are a legitimate target of that program. And I think it's very useful to go to those prospect days. So I think staffs understand, especially in those circumstances, that everybody can't do everything. And so as a result, a lot of times, because those invitations tend to come out in the middle of the summer after you've been identified earlier in the summer, saying no isn't like a deal breaker. But I do know a lot of staffs that, run events like that get really excited when somebody on their list says yes. And it definitely does turn into offers, with some frequency at the staffs that operate their events like that.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, awesome, Terry. I don't want to take any more time, and I appreciate the kind of like behind the curtain look of some of this recruiting stuff. I think it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this stuff's going to change even more from NIL and scholarship and roster stuff. But I think the general like nuts and bolts of like communication and the process, although a little later than it was after I went through it, is much the same. And we're going to equip these guys with recruiting snapshot, drafted email letters and stuff like that, just so they have some things to work off of as they kind of enter the process. So
yeah, for sure. And I'm sure that those tools are super useful. In terms of how much it's going to change, I think the short answer is I don't know. I mean, I can make an argument that it's going to stay exactly the same, just as easily as I can make an argument for any particular way that it's going to change. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I will extend my sympathy beyond just how many long flights your families have to take in order to satisfy the demand for exposure and opportunity, by saying it's an uncertain time, and so it's a bummer to have to be navigating an inherently stressful experience at an uncertain time. Like I said, you've got my sympathy on that one as well.
Well, thanks, Terry. I appreciate it, man. It was great catching up with you over this. And we'll see you on the first weekend of December, or whatever blackjack is. Terry makes his annual pilgrimage to Las Vegas. So
no doubt.
Man.
Thanks for having me, Jerry.
All right.